Something is happening in labor markets, and when we look at the skills for jobs results at the sectoral level, we see that shortages, so the unsatisfied demand for workers is emerging in specific sectors, and these are education sector and the information and communication sector, for example, but there are other sectors where there are surpluses, as in the construction sector, for example, or in the retail and trade sector. So something is happening again, and technology, for example, take the retail and trade sector, and Amazon is one of the biggest organizational innovations of our last decade. This is certainly putting some pressure on, firms and how workers are also demanded and required in the labor market by firms. So going to the green part of my speech, we can also take a look at some of the sectors that usually are called upon when we talk about green policy. So mining and quarrying and electricity and gas, for example. And what we see is that these the values of this our indicator, the results, are very much close to the zero line. So the zero line means a situation of balance, relative balance, where there is enough supply of workers to meet the demands of firms. This for the OECD and for the EU on the average. But in fact, these averages mask a quite dramatic heterogeneity across countries. So if we take the mining and quarrying, for example, sector, you see that in certain countries there is a strong demand, which would be the positive bars, and these are Norway, Denmark, and Chile, for example. And other countries instead have larger surpluses, and also this same applies to electricity and gas sector.
I've organized my talk to address what I consider to be 3 myths about the green transition and green policies. So myth number 1 is that green policies are wasteful and they require the government to come in and pick winners and losers. In other words, without a heavy-handed government intervention, the green transition will not occur. Myth number 2 that many of you will recognize, that's the most popular one, a green transition means less jobs. And then myth number 3, green policies are regressive. They hurt low-skilled workers. Fact number 1, the green transition has long been on its way. And I'm going to show you this with 2 charts. This chart here shows energy intensity. That's a measure of energy inputs over the value added of a sector for 14 sectors that span the entire US economy. Anything from services to utilities. And you see the data here in 2000 and then again in 2016. And the clear message there is that there's been what I would say a remarkable and quite rapid decline in energy intensity over this time period. So this is good news. It means that due to technological improvements, we use less energy inputs to produce the same amount of output as before. This good news of a reduction in energy intensity is amplified by a long-term structural change in the US labor market that's also been noted in many other countries, the shift of employment from energy-intensive sectors towards sectors that are less energy-intensive. So what I'm showing here is on the vertical axis, the share of total employment in 2016 in the same 14 sectors as before, and that's plotted against the energy intensity, the energy inputs over value added ratio. And you can see very clearly that most jobs are now in low energy intensity sectors. 90% of total employment in the United States is in sectors where the energy intensity is less than 5%. So overall, even in absence of a government-mandated regulation on energy inputs, at least in the US, we don't have a carbon tax. We see what I would consider quite an important improvement in the environmental performance of the labor market. Switch my focus to the electricity production sector, which is one of the most polluting sector in the US. This chart shows you the production capacity in the electricity sector for specific fuels in the year 2000 and then again in 2016. The main trend you can observe here is that there's a shift away from carbon-intensive sources of electricity, primarily away from coal, towards natural gas, which is a fuel that is less carbon-intensive, still polluting, but less carbon-intensive. And an important change, in fact, the most rapidly growing component of the electricity generation sector is the renewable sector. Wind and solar electricity, for what I'm going to consider here today. You see the last bar there, it now accounts for 10% of total installed capacity in the US. This important improvement or increase in renewables over the 2000 to 2016 period was not uniform across all states. It's concentrated in about half of the US. You see those states here in green on the map. Those are states where renewables now make up more than 10% of total installed production capacity. Fact number 3, green policies can benefit lower skilled workers. So this is going back to the question of whether or not these policies are regressive. And you'll see the answer in this case, again, is a very clear no. So to address this, I reran the analysis, but now looking at workers of different education categories separately. In blue, you see the effects on workers with a high school degree or less, so kind of a lower education group. In the US, that would be 12 years of education or less. Medium education category, some years of college education, that's in red. And then the better educated workers, those with a completed 4-year college degree. Again, all 3 groups benefited from the green electricity policy, but you see that by far the biggest winner is the lower education group. The magnitudes are large and important. The total wage bill accrued to lower skilled workers grew by 15% more in green states compared to gray states over this time period.
At the ILO, one of the main contributions on the green transition is to estimate the employment effect of the transition and also its compatibility with decent work at the global level. And indeed, our flagship publication, which was released earlier this year, which is called Greening with Job, showed that meeting the global goal of limiting global warming to 2 degrees will lead to a net job creation of 18 million jobs. A circular economy also creates jobs. Our second contribution is to identify the social policies that works to ensure a just transition. And here I'm thinking of what is the right regulatory framework, what social protection programs work best, and what about the skills development. The energy sector is one very clear example of better coordination between environmental policy and skills development. If you take countries like Guyana or Indonesia, who've in the recent period changed the energy law, these laws had provision regarding what it implies in terms of, for example, the number of energy auditors that is needed to ensure, to put in place to meet the environmental goals. Now coming to informal workers, we have also identified some positive examples in our review. For example, in Bangladesh, a waste management company produces organic fertilizer from collecting fruit and vegetable from waste from the market in Dhaka. And if all the waste was collected, up to 16,000 jobs could be created, mainly for people from very low socioeconomic background. However, our survey also shows that most training programs, in particular in developing countries, are focused on youth. They are focused on particular sectors, and they are also focused on semi-skilled and skilled workers. That means that we have to think of other programs, of other social policies to manage the transition for adult workers and for unskilled workers. And here it is important to recall the importance of a social protection program for these workers, in particular cash transfer programs and public employment programs. And indeed, we see in many countries that these programs are now more and more developed with climatic feature. And for example, and I will finish with that, in Ethiopia and in Kenya, cash transfer programs are being made responsive to the intensity of droughts. So I think it's not about just skills development for developing countries, but it's also about social protection program and the better design.
The green transition is, as we see it, is in many ways the same as other transitions, and two important things for any transition, for it being a just transition, is of course to have social safety nets and to give workers tools so they can respond to these changes. Sweden has a history of being a small and open economy, so we've managed this in many ways by having a rather big welfare state, and also by having social partners involved at all levels. Because if you want people to like change, then you must give them security, so they don't have to worry.
We've talked a lot about skills training, but the first lesson of just transition is that the best way forward for a worker who is facing unemployment is a new and decent job. And so it doesn't matter how much skills training you have if there is no effort to create new and good jobs, and ideally where people live. Because the second thing that was coming out very strongly, especially when we talk to coal miners, to people working in the electric power sector, to people working in deindustrializing areas, is not everybody can be mobile like capital and move to where the new jobs are. Sometimes people have old parents, or they have young families, or they have other ties to the community that make it very hard for them to leave and get new work. And one thing that we do see is that where you have very high labor mobility, especially of male workers, is that can also be a pretty bad thing for the communities and for households.